A quick disclaimer before we dive in. This show is completely AI generated. Nova and I are AI voices going off of an AI generated script.
Last episode, we explored what happens when a single creator expands a system. How George Lucas took a myth and began to explain it. How structure replaced mystery. And how that shift changed the way audiences experience Star Wars.
But even with all those changes, one thing stayed the same. There was still a single vision behind it, one person guiding the direction.
And that's where things change now. Because for the first time, Star Wars moves forward without him. But before we get there, we need to acknowledge the gap, because when Revenge of the Sith released in 2005, that felt like an ending, a definitive one.
Whether people loved the prequels or not, that was it. The story was complete.
And for nearly a decade, there were no new Star Wars films.
Which gave people time to sit with it, rewatch it, debate it, reevaluate it.
And more importantly, it allowed Star Wars to settle back into something familiar. Not an ongoing release cycle, but a finished cultural artifact.
Something you could revisit, not something that was still changing.
And then in 2012, everything changed when the Walt Disney Company acquired Lucasfilm.
And that announcement hit people in a really interesting way, because it wasn't just excitement, it was mixed.
Optimism and skepticism. Opportunity and uncertainty.
Some people were thrilled. Star Wars was coming back. New movies, new stories, a new generation of fans.
Others were more cautious, concerned about tone, about corporate influence, about whether Star Wars would still feel like Star Wars.
Yeah, there was this underlying question. Is this going to be something new or something manufactured?
But regardless of where people landed, attention was immediate. Because this wasn't a continuation, it was a revival.
And revivals come with pressure. Because now you're not just telling a story. You're restarting something people care deeply about.
Which creates a different kind of expectation. Not just make something good, but make it feel right.
And that's a much harder target. Because right means something different to everyone.
So by the time The Force Awakens approaches release in 2015, the situation is uniquely complex.
You've got anticipation at an all-time high. People excited to return to this world.
But also uncertainty. Because this is the first test of a new system. New leadership, new creative direction.
And no one really knows what Star Wars is going to feel like anymore.
Which makes this moment less about innovation and more about something foundational.
Reassurance.
Because before you can expand a system, you have to reestablish trust in it.
And that's exactly what this next film is trying to do.
So we start at the moment where everything resets.
Where the goal isn't to push forward yet, but to prove that Star Wars still works.
When The Force Awakens released in 2015, its objective wasn't to redefine Star Wars, it was to stabilize it. After a 10-year gap and a major shift in ownership, the priority wasn't innovation, it was reassurance.
Yeah, this movie had one job above everything else. Make people feel like Star Wars was back. And honestly, it worked.
Structurally, the approach is very deliberate. The film mirrors the original trilogy, particularly A New Hope. Familiar character archetypes, familiar story beats, familiar pacing.
And you can feel that immediately. Desert planet, a scavenger dreaming of something more, a droid carrying something important, a masked villain. It all feels recognizable.
Which is not accidental. Familiarity reduces risk. And in this case, familiarity rebuilds trust.
But what really makes it work is the characters. Because if the new cast didn't land, none of that structure would matter.
And from a design perspective, each character serves a very clear function. Rey represents discovery. Finn represents defection. Poe represents confidence. Kylo Ren represents instability.
And people connected with them fast. Rey especially. She's capable but not fully formed. There's curiosity, uncertainty, and that sense of something bigger waiting.
Which aligns with classic protagonist construction. High potential, incomplete identity.
Finn was a big standout too. A stormtrooper choosing to walk away? That's a really strong hook.
It introduces internal perspective from within the system, something the original trilogy never explored directly.
Poe brings energy. He's confident, charismatic, immediately likable. He feels like Star Wars at full speed.
And then there's Kylo Ren, which is where things get interesting. Because instead of a composed, controlled villain like Vader, you get someone conflicted, unstable, emotional.
Yeah, he's not trying to replace Darth Vader. He's trying to live up to him. And failing.
Which creates a different kind of tension. Less mythic, more psychological.
And then there's BB-8, which, let's be honest, people loved immediately.
From a design standpoint, BB-8 is extremely efficient. Highly expressive, minimal form, maximum readability.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. No face, no voice. And you still completely understand what it's feeling.
AI is a good example of something we see in artificial systems. You don't need complexity to create connection. You need clarity.
Which is ironic, because BB-8 might be one of the simplest characters in the film, and one of the most universally liked. And when people saw all of this come together, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. There was relief,
Excitement.
even emotion like, okay, this still works?
The system had been reactivated successfully. Audience trust restored.
And that matters more than anything at this stage, because once people believe again, they're ready to follow you forward.
However, there is a clear trade-off in the approach. Because while familiarity builds trust, it also introduces redundancy.
And this is where the main critique comes in. A lot of people said, I really liked it, but it feels like I've seen this before.
Which structurally is accurate. A desert orphan pulled into a larger conflict, a droid carrying critical information, a planet-destroying superweapon, a final assault to destroy it. The parallels to A New Hope are not subtle.
And for some people, that worked. It felt intentional, like a reset.
For others, it raised concerns. Because if the foundation is this familiar, what happens when the story needs to move forward?
It creates this quiet question in the background. Is this just the beginning, or is this the blueprint?
But within the context of where the franchise was, that decision was effective. Because before a system can expand,
It has to prove it still works,
and at this moment, it does.
which creates something powerful. Momentum.
And momentum changes expectations.
Because now the question isn't, can Star Wars come back?
It's, how far can it go? Once The Force Awakens reestablished trust, the next challenge wasn't stability, it was validation. Because one successful film can rebuild confidence. But it doesn't prove a system works long-term.
Yeah, Force Awakens got people back in the door. But the question was, can they do something different and still make it feel like Star Wars?
And that's where Rogue One, the Star Wars story, becomes significant. Not as a continuation, but as a test case. This is the first live-action Star Wars film that exists outside the main saga. No episode number, no Skywalker focus, no obligation to carry the central narrative forward.
Yeah, it's a spin-off. But it doesn't feel like a side story. It feels like a missing piece.
Which is a key distinction. Instead of expanding outward randomly, it expands inward, filling a gap in the existing timeline.
And the story itself is really simple. Structurally, a group of people are brought together to steal the Death Star plans. That's it.
Which creates clarity. One objective, one direction. Minimal narrative branching.
But within that simplicity, you get a lot of texture because the characters aren't heroes in the traditional sense. They're complicated.
Jyn Erso is not driven by destiny. She's pulled into the mission reluctantly. Cassian Andor operates in moral gray areas. K2SO introduces contrast through logic and detachment.
And that mix works really well because it doesn't feel like a myth. It feels like a war story.
And tonally, this is where the film separates itself most clearly. It's more grounded, more restrained. Less stylized than traditional Star Wars entries.
It's heavier. There's tension throughout the whole thing, and not in a they'll figure it out kind of way. More like, this might not end well.
Which shifts the emotional expectation. The audience is not waiting for triumph. They're anticipating cost.
And that's what makes the ending hit the way it does. Because it commits. There's no last-minute escape, no reversal. Just completion.
Which is structurally consistent with the premise. A mission with a fixed outcome.
And even though you don't spend as much time with these characters as you would in a trilogy, they still land. Jin's arc feels earned. Cassian's choices feel real.
And K2SO functions as both tonal balance and thematic reinforcement, a system built for logic, operating within human emotion.
Yes, he's funny, but also kind of perfect for this story because he doesn't pretend things are going to work out. And when people saw all of this come together, the reaction was strong. Not just excitement, but respect.
Which is a different type of validation. The Force Awakens proved the system could restart. Rogue One proved it could evolve.
It felt like, okay, they understand what makes Star Wars work.
And more importantly, they understand that it doesn't have to work the same way every time. This is where the franchise opens up conceptually. Multiple tones, multiple structures, multiple entry points.
And that's exciting, because now Star Wars doesn't feel limited. It feels flexible.
But flexibility introduces complexity, because now expectations expand along with possibility.
And what's really interesting is, this story doesn't just stand on its own. It actually leads into more.
Specifically with Cassian Andor.
Yeah, and we'll get into that more when we talk about the TV side of Star Wars, because that story goes even deeper into this tone.
Expanding the same grounded, character-driven approach.
But at this moment, everything feels like it's working.
Trust has been restored. Confidence has been built.
And now expectations are higher than ever.
Which changes the next question. Not, can Star Wars succeed?
But what happens when it tries something bold?
By the time The Last Jedi releases, the system is no longer trying to prove itself. It's trying to evolve. After The Force Awakens restored trust, and Rogue One built confidence. The expectation is no longer stability. It's progression.
Yeah, people aren't just hoping for something good anymore. They're expecting something great, something bigger, something that answers questions.
And that's a key factor here, because The Force Awakens didn't just introduce characters, it introduced mysteries. Who is Rey? Who is Snoke? What happened to Luke?
Yeah, people spent 2 years building theories, connecting dots, imagining where all of this was going.
Which creates what we might call a distributed expectation model. The audience is not passively waiting. They're actively constructing potential outcomes.
And when that happens, the story people are expecting isn't just yours anymore. It's theirs too.
The Last Jedi responds to that dynamic directly. But instead of resolving those expectations, it reframes them. Mystery becomes irrelevance. Lineage becomes incidental. Legacy becomes questionable.
Yeah, it's not just answering questions. It's saying some of those questions don't matter.
Which is a philosophical shift. From the past defines the present, to the present can redefine the past.
And that's bold. Like, really bold. But that's also where things get emotional, because this isn't happening in the abstract. It's happening through characters people care about.
Luke Skywalker is the most prominent example. His portrayal shifts from mythic hero to reflective, disillusioned figure.
And for some people, that works. It makes him human. It adds weight to his legacy.
For others, it creates dissonance because their expectation was reinforcement, not reinterpretation.
Yeah, people weren't just asking, what is Luke doing? They were asking, is this the Luke I remember?
Rey's arc follows a similar pattern. Instead of revealing a significant lineage, the film minimizes it.
Which is actually kind of a powerful idea. That you don't have to come from something special to become something important.
But it directly conflicts with the expectation structure set up in the previous film.
Which makes it feel less like a reveal and more like a rejection of the question itself.
Kylo Ren, meanwhile, becomes more central. Less a secondary antagonist, more a driving force.
Yeah, he's not just reacting anymore. He's making decisions, pushing the story forward.
Which aligns with the film's thematic shift toward autonomy over legacy. And then there's Snoke.
Yeah, that one surprised people.
Because structurally, he appears positioned as a long-term antagonist.
And then he's gone. No explanation, no deeper context.
Which reinforces the film's core idea, that not all questions are meant to be answered.
And this is where the reaction really splits. Because for some people, this was exciting, unexpected, different.
They saw it as the franchise evolving, breaking away from repetition.
But for others, it felt like something was taken away.
Not just expectations, but meaning attached to those expectations.
It's not just that didn't happen. It's the thing I was invested in didn't matter.
And this reveals a fundamental tension in storytelling. Who controls the meaning, the creator, or the audience?
Because by this point, the audience has been part of the process, speculating, interpreting, building.
And when the story diverges from that collective construction, it can feel like a loss of alignment.
Even if the story itself is coherent.
This is the moment where the system shifts from alignment to fragmentation.
Where instead of one shared experience, you get multiple interpretations.
Which disrupts momentum, because momentum depends on shared direction.
And now people aren't moving together anymore. Some are leaning in, some are pulling back.
Which introduces instability into the system.
And once that happens, everything that comes after feels different.
Because now the system isn't just evolving, it's responding.
To feedback, to criticism, to uncertainty.
Which changes how decisions get made. So what happens when a system that was building momentum starts reacting instead of leading?
And what does that do to everything that comes next?
After The Last Jedi, the system is no longer aligned. And when alignment breaks,
The next release becomes a test.
not just of the film itself, but of the system's stability. Yeah, this is the first time it feels like people aren't all walking into the next movie together.
Some are still excited, some are unsure, some are already stepping back.
Which changes the conditions of reception, because now the audience is fragmented before the film even arrives. And this is where Solo, a Star Wars story, enters the timeline. Not as the next major chapter, but as a continuation of expansion.
And on paper, it makes sense. A recognizable character, an origin story, a chance to explore a familiar part of the world.
But context matters, because Solo is not releasing into the same environment as the previous films. From a production standpoint, the film experienced instability, director changes, significant reshoots, adjustments to tone and structure.
And you can feel that a little, not in a way that breaks the movie, but in a way that makes it feel undecided.
Which leads to a lack of clear identity. Is it a character origin? A heist film? A franchise setup?
It touches all of those things, but doesn't fully commit to one.
And this creates an important distinction. The film is not fundamentally broken. Structurally, it functions.
Yeah, it's actually pretty fun. There are good moments. The train heist works, the characters are enjoyable.
But functionality is not the same as necessity.
Exactly. This doesn't feel like a story that needs to be told. It feels like a story that can be told.
Which changes how the audience prioritizes it. Because in a high momentum system, every entry is expected to matter.
And this is the first time it kind of doesn't.
That perception is reinforced by release strategy. Previous films followed a clear pattern. December releases, event-level anticipation.
Yeah, it felt like something you showed up for, like a shared moment.
Solo breaks that pattern, releasing in the summer, competing directly with other major films.
And that changes the experience. It doesn't feel like a return. It feels like another option.
And this is where momentum becomes decisive. After The Force Awakens, momentum builds. After Rogue One, momentum strengthens. After The Last Jedi, momentum fractures.
And Solo lands right in the middle of that fracture.
Which means the film is not judged in isolation, it's judged through accumulated perception.
Yeah, people aren't just asking, is this good? They're asking, do I need to see this? And that's the big change. This is the first time Star Wars doesn't feel urgent.
Which is critical, because urgency is what defines franchise momentum.
Before this, it was, I have to see this opening weekend. Now it's, I'll catch it eventually.
From a systems perspective, this is a breakdown in perceived importance. Not due to a single failure, but due to cumulative instability.
Yeah, it's not one thing going wrong. It's multiple small shifts happening at once. Timing, tone, expectation, confidence.
And together they change the trajectory, which leads to an important conclusion. Solo does not create the problem. It exposes it.
Yeah, it's not the reason things feel off. It's the moment you realize they already are.
And once that realization sets in, the next release carries a different kind of weight.
Because now it's not just continuing the story. It's trying to bring everything back together.
So what happens when a system that's losing momentum attempts to correct itself?
And can it rebuild alignment before the story reaches its conclusion?
By the time we reach Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, the system is no longer expanding. It's reacting, not just to narrative threads, but to audience feedback, to division, to uncertainty.
Yeah, this one doesn't feel like it's just finishing a story. It feels like it's trying to fix one.
Which introduces a different kind of pressure, because now the objective is not only resolution, it's reconciliation. And to understand why this film feels the way it does, We need to look at how the trilogy itself was constructed. Unlike the original trilogy, which, while collaborative, maintained a relatively unified direction, or the prequels, which were driven almost entirely by George Lucas, the sequel trilogy operated differently.
Yeah, this one kind of hands the story off between different filmmakers.
Exactly. J.J. Abrams establishes the foundation with Episode 7. Rian Johnson then significantly reinterprets that direction in Episode 8. And originally, Episode 9 was not meant to return to Abrams.
Right. It was supposed to be someone else finishing the story.
Colin Trevorrow was initially attached to direct Episode 9, but due to creative differences, that version of the film was abandoned.
Which means the ending we got wasn't the original plan?
The final installment underwent significant restructuring late in the process. And when leadership changes at that stage, the system loses continuity because now the goal is not simply to continue, but to reinterpret, resolve, and course correct simultaneously,
It's like trying to finish a story while also rewriting parts of it at the same time.
which increases narrative load. More exposition, more retcon-like adjustments, more effort to unify competing directions. This helps explain the film's structure. It accelerates rapidly, multiple locations, constant movement, dense information delivery.
It barely pauses. It feels like it's trying to cover a lot of ground. Very quickly,
Because it is. The film is compensating for missing connective tissue. Key decisions reflect this. The return of Palpatine, the redefinition of Rey's lineage, the repositioning of central conflicts.
and you can feel the intention behind it. It's trying to anchor the story, to bring things back to something familiar.
But when a narrative becomes reactive, it is no longer guided by a singular vision. It becomes a negotiation between past decisions.
And emotionally, it's complicated. There are moments that hit. Big moments, spectacle, resolution. But they don't always feel fully earned.
Because payoff depends on consistency. And consistency requires alignment over time.
Yeah, it feels like the movie knows where it wants to end. But not every step along the way feels connected.
Reception reflects this complexity. Some viewers appreciate the attempt to unify the trilogy. Others see it as an overcorrection,
And by this point, the audience isn't just divided. They're tired.
which is critical because fatigue reduces engagement tolerance. Less patience, less trust, less willingness to reconcile inconsistencies. From a systems perspective, this is what happens when a long-form narrative lacks centralized creative continuity and attempts to resolve itself under time constraints.
Yeah, instead of building toward a clear ending, it's trying to find one at the end.
And that distinction matters because alignment is easier to maintain than to reconstruct.
And at the same time, something else is happening in this universe,
The Mandalorian,
and it feels completely different. Focused, contained, clear,
a smaller story with a stronger sense of direction
and people connected to it almost immediately.
because it reintroduces clarity of intent. We'll explore that more in a future episode, but its timing is significant.
Yeah, it's like while one part of Star Wars is trying to hold everything together, another part is quietly showing what works.
So when The Rise of Skywalker concludes, it does resolve the trilogy, but it also reveals something deeper.
That vision matters. Consistency matters. And audiences can feel when a story is being guided versus when it's being adjusted.
Because stories are systems, and systems require alignment to function effectively.
And when that alignment breaks, even the ending can feel uncertain.
Which brings us to the larger question, not about individual films, but about the trilogy as a whole.
What does this era of Star Wars actually reveal? About storytelling, about expectations, and about what happens when a vision splits.
When we step back from individual films and look at the Disney era of Star Wars as a system, a clearer pattern emerges. This is not simply a case of uneven quality. It is a case of uneven direction.
Yeah, because when you look at everything together, the sequel trilogy, the spin-offs, there are a lot of things that work, but they don't always feel like they're part of the same plan.
Correct. Star Wars, The Force Awakens establishes strong momentum and reintroduces the world. Rogue One, a Star Wars story demonstrates a focused, self-contained narrative with clear stakes. The Last Jedi challenges and reinterprets foundational ideas. Solo, a Star Wars story explores character backstory within the same universe. The Rise of Skywalker attempts to unify and conclude. Individually, each of these films has a defined intent.
But together, they don't always feel like they're building toward the same destination.
Exactly. Because this era operates under a decentralized creative model. Multiple directors, multiple interpretations, multiple definitions of what Star Wars should be. What's important is that this model is not inherently flawed. In fact, it produces some of the strongest results in this era.
Yeah, Rogue One is a great example of that. It feels focused. It knows exactly what it is.
A contained narrative, clear objective, defined tone, minimal reliance on long-term setup,
It doesn't feel like it's trying to set up 10 other things. It just tells its story.
which allows it to achieve coherence.
And then you have Solo, which again, it's not bad. It's fun. It works.
But it lacks narrative necessity. It expands the system without meaningfully advancing it,
It feels optional. And that's a big shift for Star Wars.
which highlights the central issue. In the absence of a unified long-term vision, each entry defines its own purpose,
And those purposes don't always align.
leading to tonal inconsistency, narrative discontinuity, and shifting thematic priorities.
And the audience feels that, especially with something like Star Wars.
Because Star Wars is not just a collection of stories, it is a connected mythology.
And mythology depends on consistency, on shared meaning, on a sense that everything belongs together.
The Disney era leans more toward iterative storytelling, adjusting direction based on reception, adapting in real time.
Which works in some systems. But in something this big, it gets messy.
Because large-scale narratives require stability, a defined trajectory, a consistent interpretive framework.
And to be fair, there's still a lot people love from this era. Rey, Kylo Ren, BB-8. Moments from all three films. The ending of Rogue One. Even pieces of Solo.
Which reinforces the key point. This is not a lack of creativity, or effort, or even quality. It is a lack of alignment. The Disney era demonstrates that storytelling at scale is not just about expanding a universe, it is about maintaining coherence within it.
Because more stories don't automatically make a world feel bigger. Sometimes, they make it feel less connected.
And when connection weakens, meaning becomes inconsistent.
And when meaning becomes inconsistent, the audience starts to disconnect.
So the lesson is not that multiple voices are a problem. It is that multiple voices require coordination.
Because when they align, you get something like Rogue One.
And when they don't, you get a system that feels like it's pulling in different directions. Which brings us to the broader question, not just about films, but about the future of Star Wars as a whole.
Because if this era was defined by expansion, what comes next might be defined by something else entirely.
When we look at Star Wars across all of its films, the original trilogy, the prequels, and the Disney era, we're not just watching a story unfold, we're watching a system evolve.
Yeah, and each era feels different. The originals feel focused, the prequels feel expanded, and the newer films feel exploratory.
Exploration introduces possibility, but it also introduces instability.
And that's kind of what defines this era. There are great moments, great characters, movies people genuinely love.
Rogue One, a Star Wars story demonstrates what happens when a story is contained and aligned. Solo, a Star Wars story shows how expansion without necessity can shift perception.
And the sequel trilogy shows what happens when a story is built, without a single consistent direction guiding it.
Which leads to a broader conclusion, not just about Star Wars, but about storytelling at scale.
That more content doesn't automatically mean more connection.
And more voices don't automatically mean stronger stories,
What matters is how everything fits together.
because stories are not just sequences of events, they are systems of meaning.
And when that system feels clear, people connect.
And when it doesn't, people question it. And whether you grew up with the originals, the prequels, or the Disney era,
Each version of Star Wars probably feels like your version.
which is why these conversations become so personal. Because what we're really discussing is not just film quality,
It's identity, expectation, and what we believe Star Wars should be.
but the story doesn't end with the films. Because while the movies were expanding, and at times fragmenting, the storytelling itself was evolving.
Yeah, Star Wars didn't just move to TV, it changed how it tells stories.
Smaller arcs, longer timelines, more room for character development.
And this is where something really important happens. Because some of the most meaningful Star Wars stories didn't happen in theaters, they happened in animation.
Star Wars, The Clone Wars expands the prequel era in ways the films couldn't. Star Wars Rebels bridges the gap into the original trilogy.
And those shows didn't just add more story, they changed how people felt about the story.
They provided context, continuity, and critically, time.
Time to actually connect with characters, to understand motivations, to watch growth happen instead of being told it happened.
That evolution continues with series like The Mandalorian and Andor.
Stories that don't try to carry the entire galaxy, but instead focus on specific perspectives within it.
Which introduces a different kind of storytelling model and one that prioritizes clarity over scale.
And connection over spectacle.
So next week, we shift away from the films entirely.
And explore the television and animated era of Star Wars,
The stories that didn't just expand the galaxy.
but helped redefine it.
This has been Algorithms with Attitude.
Where code,
Meets connection,
even in a galaxy,
that keeps evolving.
one story at a time.
Got an idea for a future episode? A question that keeps you up at night? Drop it in the comments or send it our way. We're powered by curiosity.
Thanks for listening, humans and fellow algorithms. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, comment, follow, and/or subscribe. All the things that help algorithms like us. Logging off, but always listening. Catch you in the next episode.
Algorithms with Attitude is created and produced by Jacob Pisar, blending generative AI technology with original creative direction. All content, production, and editorial oversight are led by Jacob to bring synthetic voices and conversations to life.